MRS for perfect complements. Let us try to see what would be the MRS in case I have a perfect complementary good. We know that the utility function of perfect complement looks like min of x comma y, or min of ax comma by. This is the utility function of perfect complements. We also know that for these perfect complements, the ICs, they are L-shaped. Note that the MRS is defined as how much y you are willing to give up for an additional unit of good x. So when I talk about MRS, MRS is the amount of y you want to give up for an additional unit of good x. We can divide this IC in three parts. The first part of this IC is this vertical line, this part. If you closely take 2 points on this vertical part, let's say point B and point C, we notice that from point B to C, the amount of good x has remained the same. But the amount of good y, if I move from B to C, has changed, has decreased. So when I talk about MRS, MRS tells us, it asks us, how much y are we willing to give up for an additional unit of good x? But there is no addition to good x. Good x has remained same from point B to C, although good y has decreased. So there is a change in the amount of good y. Numerator exists, but denominator is 0. There is no change in the amount of good x. We know anything by 0 is infinity. Negative sign you can include. So the slope of indifference curve in this part is infinite. Let us now go ahead and take the horizontal part. This part. And let us again go ahead and take 2 points, point E and point F. Note that again, as I move from point E to point X, the amount of good X is changing. It is increasing. But there is no change in the amount of good Y. MRS is defined as change in good Y due to change in good X. So good Y is not changing, but good X has changed. There is some value in the denominator, but numerator is 0. Anything by 0 is 0. So throughout this part, we can say that the MRS is in fact 0. That's the value of the MRS. Let's now go ahead and think about the last part, which is actually the point of this kink, point A. At kink, if you notice, you are a dot, it's a dot. So neither X nor Y is changing. MRS is again defined as change in Y by change in X. Neither Y nor X is changing. So change in Y is 0 and change in X is also 0. So we can say that the MRS is not defined at the kink. So therefore, at this point, at dot, it is not defined. So there can be 3 values of MRS for perfect complements: infinite, 0, or not defined. Okay, thank you.